Hi, all. Welcome to the GODSTER Show. This is Frank Samuel, and peace be unto you all. So, I have one question to you all. Is suffering a part of God's plan? So, did this question ever trigger you all? Like, we have a lot of hardships, we suffer in many things in many ways in our everyday life. For example, suffering might be in your professional life, it might be your personal life. For example, it might also be your monthly installment, your education, a family problem, with your parents, with your relatives, with your spouse. Suffering might be in any manner. So, what do we do when we are going through these hardships in life? Do we pray about it or do we blame God for it? Is suffering a part of God's plan? So, the answer is yes, suffering is a part of God's plan. God allows suffering. So, what do? We have two choices. Either we drift away from God or we get closer to God when we are suffering. So let's see what God has to say about why suffering is a part of God's plan. Now, I'd like to tell you all a story. There was a man who had a well to do job. He had a beautiful house, he had a lovely wife, beautiful kids. He was living happily in his life. His boss called him. He told that he has been promoted. Now, promotion comes with a lot of requirements, and the requirement for him is that he has to travel to different places. It's like a marketing job or something like that. Now, what happens? He started traveling, he started giving less time to his family, and he was more outside the house. He was traveling, and his family hardly got to see him. Now, as and when he excelled in his work, he became a successful employee, and that created a pride in his head. So, what happens when you're prideful? You distance yourself from God, and that's what happened to him. Because of his pride, he distances himself from the family, he also distanced himself from God, and then he was just enjoying whatever came his way, all the worldly pleasures. As and when he was traveling, he started getting closer and closer to all unwanted people. And his wife came to know about this. So, what happened? Now, this is a kind of suffering that wife is going through. She knows that her husband is somewhere doing something. So, what happened? Will she blame God for this suffering? Or should she get closer to God because she's suffering? What she did? She knew that the battle is not hers. She knew that this fight is not hers. Instead, she started praying to God. She prayed to God to take control over whatever she's going through. She started praying to God, asking Him to fight this out for her. And this is what she did. She started getting closer and closer to God while she was suffering. Now, this is what I want to say. It isn't God's plan for your spouse to cheat on you. It isn't God's plan. If one of your family members falls sick, that isn't God's plan. It isn't God's plan if you feel abandoned, if you fall sick. It isn't God's plan if you find yourself in an abusive relationship. Nothing is of God's plan. The broken family, crime, jail, orphanages. This isn't God's plan. But this still happens. Why? Ever since sin entered into the world, we all live in a decayed state. And that's why this is happening. The wife started praying thoroughly, day in and day out. She started praying, and God started performing miracles in her life. Because of office politics, the husband got tired and he felt like quitting his job. He put down his papers, he resigned, and he was jobless. He wasn't getting placed anywhere else. He was jobless, he was struggling. He was struggling so bad. He was weeping day in and day out. His pride had a downfall finally. But is this suffering God's plan? So let's see what the husband did. He was sitting in his house. He was weeping, he was mourning, he was feeling bad about whatever has happened to him. He had no way to go. He's not able to show his face to anyone. But then, when he looked up, he saw a Bible verse on a wall frame hung on his wall. And that Bible verse is nothing but Hebrews 13:5. It says, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Yes, when he read that verse, he started realizing what had gotten to him. He started understanding what kind of a person he was and what he became. He was feeling bad about it. He wanted to confess. He wanted to pray. He immediately sat down. He turned his Bible and asked him when he turned his Bible, the verse that came in front of him was John 16:20. Now let's see what John 16:20 says. It says, I am telling you the truth. You will cry and weep, but the world will be glad. You will be sad, but your sadness will turn into gladness. You will cry and weep, but the world will be glad. So the world might be rejoicing when you are going through a tough time in your life. The world might be rejoicing when you are suffering. The world might be rejoicing when you're having a downfall. But then the grief that you have will be turned into joy, and that's what God has promised here. You're no longer going to suffer. Suffering is not for a longer time. Your mourning will be turned into joy, and this is exactly what God has promised. He read this verse, he confessed, he started praying, he asked God for forgiveness. He made it right with God, he made it right with his family, and God started blessing him. And this is what happens while you're suffering. God takes control of the situation. He wants to know, he uses these broken, ugly timings into your life. If you're going through a tough time, God uses the timings. He gives hope to the hopeless. He turns mourning into joy. He's a light in darkness, and that's what he is if you let him in. And that is what it also says in Romans 8:28. And what it says in Romans 8:28, we know that in all things God works for good with those who love him, those whom he has called according to his purpose. Yes, it clearly says, we know that in all things God works for good with those who love him. This is the Bible verse. This is what you're supposed to read when you are going through tough times in your life. Whatever is happening in your life, it is in God's plan. When you're suffering about something, when you're having hardship in life, this isn't God's plan. God allows suffering only for you to get closer to him. And that's what he does. He turns your mourning into joy. He gives hope to the hopeless. He is the light in the darkness if you let him be. We all know that in all things, God works for good if you start loving him. So, God does allow suffering. And now, the choice is ours. If we have to blame God for it and drift away from him, or if we have to get closer to him, especially when we are suffering, and pray to him about it, you will know the result. So saying this, I'll see you all in the next video. Until then, stay safe, stay strong, and don't give up on faith.